Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Silber from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His topic is From Christian to New Jew, From Court Jew to State Jew, the Odyssey of the Aguilar family.
I wanted to begin at first with an apology that this is actually very far from the area of my expertise, and I'm really a tyro when it comes to this field. And also that I'm going to mangle all the Portuguese and Spanish names, so please just wince along with me. Renée might remember that when I first started this project, I approached her and she told me that the best person to consult was Claude Stuczynski, and indeed that was a very good advice. The juxtaposition of state Jew in contradiction to court Jew, which has gained currency in recent years thanks to the pioneering work of Pierre Birnbaum, is in fact not a modern neologism. The Austrian Orientalist Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, the author of the multi-volume history of the Ottoman Empire, coined the term Hof- und Staatsjude as early as 1829 in reference to the former New Christian, then New Jew, Juan Miquez, better known as Don Joseph Nassi, who died in 1579. While court Jew implies activity in the economic sphere, and state Jew in the realm of politics and diplomacy, in fact, both are interrelated and are embedded in the twin processes of the rise of capitalism and the emergence of the modern state. In the initial stages of both developments, the weakness of state and economy created unique opportunities and niches for enterprising Jews and Conversos to fill. This short presentation will focus primarily on the personage of, here goes the Portuguese, Diogo Aguilar, and or he's known as Diego de Aguilar, or as Moshe Lopes Pereira, born in Porto in 1696. Not many people know that. Died in London, 10th of August, 1759. Several aspects of de Aguilar's life and activities are noteworthy. First, he was one of the handful of Jews who were ennobled during the Ancien regime, being granted the title of Baron of the Holy Roman Empire in 1726 by the Emperor Karl. This is the coat of arms he received from the College of Arms in London in recognition of his continental title. Although at the time noble honorifics increasingly came to be challenged, nevertheless the title did provide a certain advantage. Second, he was a court Jew, perhaps one of the last significant ones closing an era, and as such he shored up a weak state by offering to lease its tobacco monopoly, a task that the state itself had failed earlier to administer successfully. But he also engaged in other economic activities on behalf of the emerging state, entering into various contracts and also serving as a private banker. Third, his financial activities led to his appointment as a state bureaucrat of sorts, thus becoming one of the first state Jews, serving in an official capacity as the cashier of the Netherlands and Italian Council. Fourth, serving in these capacities, de Aguilar formed one of the densest networks that encompassed both Jews and non-Jews and enabled him to play a key role in mobilizing support during moments of crisis. Expulsion and recall were the events that most stimulated the political dimension of Conversos and Jews. De Aguilar was involved to a greater or lesser degree in three such instances. Interestingly, he, so to speak, inherited some of the features mentioned above, and thus a brief review of his family history is in order. This will touch on the history, on identity as new Christians and new Jews, on their particular economic niche, and finally the political dimension. What will become clear as we come to focus on the activities of de Aguilar himself, that although the Converso/Portuguese political dimension will be present, nevertheless it will begin to lose its peculiarities and become submerged in a more encompassing Jewish politics that crossed the Portuguese, Ponentine, Levantine, as well as the Ashkenazi divide. The family. Location, we are told, is everything. So too the fate of d'Aguilar's ancestors were pretty much determined by their geographic origins. Thanks to the Inquisition, if one is permitted to say this, in the files of his grandfather, Francisco Lopez Pereira, we can find information that enables us to trace the d'Aguilar's family back to the end of the 16th century. Both sides of Francisco's family came from small towns in the Trás-os-Montes region in the northeast of Portugal near the Spanish border. The Lopez family came from Chassim, and the Pereiras from Mogaduro. Well, I'm on backwards. Okay. This is Mogaduro. You can see when I took a car from Braganza, it took around 4 hours. And Chassim is not even on the map. It's something around an hour, half an hour by car down here. Hence the combination of the Lopez and the Pereiras created Lopez Pereira, the family name, which Francisco was the first to bear in 1617 within his family. Of course, there are numerous Lopez Pereiras, and the first half year I spent was just trying to get rid of everyone, and apparently no one is related to this family as Lopez Pereiras. The history of the Lopez Pereiras echoes the general rhythms of new Christians on the peninsula, their persecutions, their migratory and settlement patterns, their occupational preferences. Like many Spanish Jews in 1492, they too probably fled to Portugal, to cities just across the border. Both Chassim and Mogaduro were small towns with sizable new Christian population, and were to figure large in the annals of the Inquisition in both Portugal and Spain. I would guess around 1/3 of the population at least is new Christian in these places. Together, these two towns contributed about 10% of the 5,000 condemned by the Spanish Inquisition. When at the 1652 auto de fe at Coimbra, the 35-year-old Francisco was condemned by Portuguese Inquisition to incarceration in abjuracio conforma, that is a harsher form of public confession of errors and affirmation of belief in Christ. He was but one more instance in the growing wave of persecution of new Christians since 1640 in the newly independent Portugal. There were dozens of others from Mogaduro and Chassim at the same auto de fe. One was relaxed in the flesh, that is burned alive. Like many new Christians, Francisco fled to what he thought was the more liberal climate of Spain, only to be greeted with a sudden upswing in the Spanish Inquisition's activities. His trial before the Toledo Inquisition began in 1658 and lasted 6 years, including several sessions of torture, and concluded in 1664 in an auto de fe where he was condemned a duración de vehemente, again the harsher of public confessions, and sentenced to 2 years and exiled from Granada, his residence, for 8 years. And 6 years later, we find Francisco once again before the Toledo Inquisition, this time accompanied by his wife, his younger brother Diego Lopez Pereira, and his son, the 23-year-old Manuel Lopez Pereira, our d'Aguilar's father. Manuel escaped lightly with exile and 15 days of intensive catechism, while his parents and uncle took part in the famous auto de fe of Toledo of 19 October 1670. This time, Francisco and his wife Maria were condemned only to abjuración de levi, a lighter punishment, but the 43-year-old Diego, the younger brother of Francisco, was condemned to life imprisonment. Other more distant members of this family also had frequent brushes with the Inquisition. 8 of the total of 118 condemned at the General Auto de Fe in Madrid on the 30th June of 1680, a scene captured in the famous painting of Francisco Rizzi, were cousins of the Lopez Pereiras from Mogaduro. But the heaviest blow came in 1682. Gaspar, the eldest son of Francisco and the older brother of Manuel, returned to Portugal a few years earlier. He was seized by the Portuguese Inquisition and burned alive at the Lisbon Auto de Fe in 1682. A contemporary English account by Michael Geddes describes the event thus. Age 43, Gaspar Lopez Pera, a new Christian, a merchant, a bachelor, the son of Francisco Lopez Pera, a native of the town of Mogaduru, an inhabitant of Madrid, a resident of Lisbon, convicted, confessing, affirmative, professing the law of Moses, obstinate and impenitent. Together with Antonio de Aguiar and Miguel Enriquez, quote, these three were burnt alive within 2 hours after the Inquisition had delivered them to the secular arm, unquote. Here we can pause and note that it was Gaspar who was involved in the first of the 4 episodes that I want to touch on, involving expulsion and political activity that the family had at hand. In the wake of new threats to expel new Christians from Portugal, Gaspar became involved in the campaign mounted in 1673 to receive a general pardon. It was a fellow townsman, indeed members of the wealthy and influential Mogaduru family in Lisbon, who approached Gaspar. At the end of August 1673, in the house of Antonio Rodriguez Marquez, Gaspar was prevailed upon to take important missives relating to the general pardon to Rome. He embarked upon the trip, but due to his sickness, his arrival was delayed. He was met with furious reception by Father Francisco Azevedo, who accused him of maliciously holding up the papers, enabling the rival documents to arrive first. Words were exchanged, knives were drawn. Gaspar claimed that his reputation was now sullied, and new Christians throughout the Iberian Peninsula viewed him as a traitor. Gaspar was arrested by the Lisbon Inquisition in 1675. For long stretches he denied any Judaizing, until, broken, he came out with a resounding Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, and defiantly declared himself an unrepentant Judaizer. As an affirmativo, he was burned alive at the stake. Francisco's younger son, Manuel de Aguilar, as he called himself, this is when the first time that the name de Aguilar is adopted, I have no idea why, also returned to Portugal toward the end of the century. If we can trust the evidence of the list of the Portuguese autos de fe, we can conclude that neither Manuel nor the young Diogo had further to do with the Inquisition. With the renewed persecution in Portugal in the second and third decade of the 18th century, a wave of immigrants began to reach the western Sephardic communities, and among them Diego and his family. From this long litany of woes of the Lopez Pereira, even skeptics could conclude that this was one genuinely Judaizing family, although what precisely they practiced and believed is not known to us. The question that arises, if so, why did they not leave the peninsula in earlier waves of emigration, as many did in the middle of the decades of the 17th century? From an info, we know that Francisco had planned indeed to escape to France sometime in the 1650s, but had failed to carry it off. The answer, I think, lies with the particular economic niche the family came to occupy, namely tobacco leasing. Here, once again, the family was typical of more general New Christian patterns in its choice of economic endeavor. The tobacco monopoly was first introduced in Castile and Portugal in the 1630s, and from its very inception, the presence of New Christians was immediately felt at every level of the branch, from the administrator general of the lease at the very top to the numerous subcontractors down to estanqueros who sold tobacco at the street corners. And here you have a list. You can see who is a Portuguese New Christian, who is not, of the general state monopoly. It was the one economic niche which New Christians continued to dominate long after the onset of their economic decline in middle of the 17th century. And attachment to this niche may very well have prolonged the D'Aguilars to stay in Iberia. This is more a regional sort of things, where I could locate who were New Christians for sure. A year after freeing Portugal, Francisco leased the tobacco monopoly of Granada in 1653 for the hefty sum of 215,000 reales. This was but one of the many government contracts or asientos which were farmed out by the state. Francisco had enjoyed the patronage of Juan de Rosales, the general lessee of tobacco, and the influential Diego Gomez de Salazar in Madrid. The same year, he contracted the salt lease in Malaga, and in 1658, the year of his incarceration, he took on the lease for the Milones of Granada. Interestingly, the family seems to have emerged from the repeated ordeals with the Inquisition with their considerable resources intact, despite the fact that many other new Christian merchants had their properties confiscated and fortunes utterly ruined. In fact, Francisco's extended family, which I have not shown over here, I took it out, abandoned Mogaduru, and within years we find them in the tobacco trade all along the cities of Andalusia. They're in Granada, Cordova, Malaga, Jaén, if I got it right, and Jaén, excuse me, this is Spanish. Antequera, among others. Antequera. There's always someone from Antequera in the crowd. I'm sorry. In 1674, we find Francisco and the younger Manuel undertaking the provisioning of the city of Cuenca, but no doubt their most spectacular achievement took place in 1677, when the father and son partnership contracted the tobacco lease for the entire kingdom of Castile for 7 years for an annual sum of 11,250,000 reales. This placed Francisco near the very apex of the economic community, certainly firmly in the second tier at least. However, 2 years later, in 1679, the contract bankrupted them, but they rebounded again 4 years later when they once again assumed the tobacco administration in 1683. They were among the last new Christians to lease this asiento. The state now reformed the system, and when once again it offered the lease to private contractors in the beginning of the 18th century, new Christians were explicitly excluded from partaking in it. And over here, of course, note that the term Jew is used rather than new Christian. Francisco passed away toward the end of the 17th century, and Manuel moved back to Portugal. He seemed to have recovered his fortunes, for in 1710 he became the general administrator of tobacco monopoly of the entire Portuguese kingdom for 3 years. Toward the end of his lease, Manuel fell ill and died, and Diego, in his late teens at the time, took over his business obligations. Sometime before 1718, he surfaces with his mother and 2 sisters in London. The wealthy Portuguese merchants and bankers arriving in Spain from Lisbon during the rule of the Count Duke Olivares began to abandon the Iberian Peninsula with the renewal of the Spanish Inquisition in 1650s. Most of the lucrative asientos were lost to the new Christians. The tobacco lease stood out as a last remnant and remained a new Christian niche until the beginning of the 18th century, when Jews were banned. The Lopez Pereiras could still hang on because in a shrinking new Christian economy, the tobacco lease was still rewarding. What is striking is that with the exception of Gaspar's undertaking, Francisco and Manuel, despite their prominent economic position, seem to have taken no part in any collective effort on behalf of new Christians. This was, however, not the case with Diego. Let us now turn to Diego de Aguilar and summarize the basic elements of his biography. We now know that he was born in Oporto, Portugal, in 1696, again to Manuel de Aguilar, and his spouse Branca Teresa, known to us by her Jewish name Sarah, as the name appears in the Jewish cemetery in Vienna. Like many new Christians, he possessed more than one family name. Alternately, he was also called Lopez Pereira. The name Moses he acquired after arriving in Amsterdam and thence London with his family sometime before August 1718, when the wedding of one of his 2 sisters, Rachel, took place to Jacob Alveras Pereira. The later, also known as Gabriel de Lima, joined de Aguilar in lifelong partnership, establishing the firm Pereira and Lima, that by 1723, that is very few years after this, was listed among the most prominent London importers of gold bullion from Portugal. In 1725, under the name of Moses Lopez Pereira, he was denizened in England along with one of the Lopez Suazos. He had now become a prominent member of the London Ma'amad, and in 1730 was even elected a Gabbai, a post he turned down. In 1726, he was summoned to Vienna to devise a plan to reform the faltering state tobacco monopoly, and although his proposals were not accepted, he was rewarded by the emperor by being ennobled as a baron of his realm, an unusual distinction, especially in the swiftness in which this was done, that only one other Jewish family in Europe shared at that time, and that was the Lopez Suazos. Later that year, he married Simcha de Fonseca, a marriage that was to produce over the next 3 decades 14 children, and those are the ones that survived to adulthood until the very end of Simcha's life in 1755 at the age of 46. Around 1732, he moved to Austria with his mother, wife, children, and family, and the family of his second brother-in-law, Jacob Yeshurun Alvarez, who had married his sister Esther in 1722. Yeshurun Alvarez, presumably another partner, died, however, soon later in 1735, and is buried also in the Viennese Jewish cemetery. Employing Christian frontmen, d'Aguilar leased the state tobacco monopoly for a period of 5 years. He later emerged from the background and openly contracted 2 more times to lease the monopoly until 1747. We see here a remarkable continuity in the history of a new economic branch that became identifiably Jewish, occupied first by Iberian New Christians, then Sephardi New Jews, and finally, after d'Aguilar, this was the source of fortune for Austrian Jews, mainly Ashkenazi Jews, until the end of Joseph II's reign. The Asiento system of the 17th century Spain and Portugal created the kind of opportunities for new Christians that had a lot in common with those accorded court Jews by state building and weak administrative apparatus in Central Europe. Diego d'Aguilar was the rare living link between these two worlds, between the Iberian Peninsula of new Christians and Central European Hofjuden. His economic activities were by no means confined to tobacco leasing. While he continued his London partnership with de Lima, he also entered into partnership in 1730s with the most prominent court Jews in Vienna, Löw-Zinsheim, who was, quote, engaged in every kind of government loan, purchase of bonds, and foreign remittance. In the 1740s, d'Aguilar helped finance the construction of Schönbrunn Palace and was also engaged as Kassier, as I said, du Conseil Suprême des Pays-Bas. That is of Belgium, which at that time was, of course, part of the Habsburg monarchy. His economic activities enabled him to build a network of connections with important state officials and foreign diplomats. He became close to the Portuguese-born Count Tarroca, a key figure in Maria Theresa's small circle of advisors, who was placed in charge of building Schönbrunn, and also served as the president of the Italian and the Netherlands Council. We shall return to him. D'Aguilar did not neglect Jewish communal affairs. As mentioned, he founded the Turkish-Spanish synagogue in 1734, or maybe 36, donating a set of silver imonim which still could be seen late in the 19th century. Sephardi communities throughout Europe were in contact with him, and he could be counted on to contribute to various philanthropic activities and to channel funds, especially to the Vad Yehudei Kushta in Istanbul, which supported the 3 holy communities in Eretz Israel. He also did not neglect the Ashkenazim. He had the trust and close friendship of the Viennese court Jews, Mark Schlesinger and Löw-Zinsheim, key figures in Vienna, served as godfather to their children and executor of their testaments. Moravian communities such as Holleschau and Alzey, threatened by expulsion or other harsh measures, inevitably turned to d'Aguilar to intercede on their behalf. Sometime in 1755, d'Aguilar returned to London. Unlikely rumors that it had been the Inquisition that requested his extradition and this is why he fled Vienna, this is probably has no basis. Perhaps it was economic motives, like the death of his London partner in 1754, or family reasons, like the need to find a suitable Sephardi match for his numerous offspring, that prompted this move. In any case, once in England, he indenizened his 5 sons, applied for a coat of arms in 1756, as we have seen. He was lionized in London, elected to the Melamed for the 1756-57 year. Only the death of his wife cast a pall on the elevated status he enjoyed. His 21-year-old son Ephraim made a spectacular match, marrying Sarah, the daughter of Moses Mendes de Costa, who came with an enormous dowry of 150,000 pounds. She died in 1763, and 4 years later he remarried, this time the widow of the wealthy Benjamin da Costa, and she too brought with her a sizable fortune. Ephraim d'Aguilar is known in English law because of the trial between him and his wife. This was probably a key trial in terms of wife abuse, so this is also something very interesting. He's still cited. The young Ephraim was also quickly drafted into the Melamed, serving as Gabbai in the 1759-60 year. In time, every London Sephardi family was to bind himself with the d'Aguilars, the Mendes de Costas, the da Costas, the Lopez Suazos, the Gomez Serra, the Salvadors, the Baruch Lusados, the Francos, the list goes on. Moses Lopez Pereira, also known as Baron Diego d'Aguilar, died on August 10, 1759, and was buried in the so-called Novo Cemetery in London next to his wife. When the Emperor Karl died in 1740 without a male heir, the War of Austrian Succession broke out. Despite the so-called pragmatic sanction, the young Maria Theresa was not recognized as the ruler of the Habsburg monarchy. French, Bavarian, and Prussian troops invaded the realm. With great energy and skill, the young queen managed to recover most of her possessions, but the process was painful, especially in light of the extensive evidence that treason had been widespread. Especially the Jewish communities of Bohemia and Moravia incurred her wrath. In short order, 2 expulsion decrees tested the political and diplomatic skills of the Jewish establishment, and in both instances, d'Aguilar played a key role. The lesser-known expulsion, contemplated by Maria Theresa, was to expel the Jews of Moravia in 1742. Foreign troops had occupied the land, and when they were repulsed, the Queen in fury ordered the Moravian jury, who was seen to collaborate with the enemy, be expelled en masse. Although expulsion was seen as being out of pace with the more enlightened times, it should be recalled that less than a decade earlier, the expulsion of the Salzburg Protestants horrified the European public opinion. And no Habsburg Jew could forget the expulsion of Jews from Vienna in 1670. D'Aguilar's role in having the order cancelled is acknowledged by contemporary chronicles, who also extol the part played by the Moravian chief Rabbi Aeschylus. How and why they succeeded is not clear, but from a later letter of the papal nuncio, we learned that the great Moravian magnates protested that their income would be severely damaged with the expulsion. So perhaps there was really no need for Jewish intercession, considering that self-interest would have motivated these aristocrats. Nevertheless, Aeschylus and d'Aguilar are explicitly praised for their part in preventing the edict. In particular, d'Aguilar's close friendship with Field Marshal Prince Wenzel Liechtenstein is mentioned as playing an important role. Here the imagination of contemporary chroniclers takes flight and locates the close ties forged between the two during this War of Spanish Succession on the Iberian Peninsula. Although fanciful, d'Aguilar's connection to the highborn was not implausible. The second episode of expulsion was far more tragic and required greater resourcefulness. In the winter, where am I going? Okay. I'm going the wrong way, excuse me. Here it is. Okay. In the winter of 1744, the young Queen Maria Theresa, and in time the Jews of Moravia and Bohemia and Moravia were to follow. There were well-grounded fears that she was planning to expel Jews from other lands in her empire and in turn inspire a wave of similar measures elsewhere in Europe. As the late Baruch Mavorach so masterfully demonstrated in several studies, a network of court Jews undertook to lobby the courts of Europe to bring pressure upon the empress to revoke her decree. At the center of these efforts was d'Aguilar, whose quarter served as the meeting place where strategies were formulated. He had a severe case of gout, and therefore he couldn't leave. First, let us look at the network infrastructure that d'Aguilar could count on, both in the Jewish and non-Jewish world. D'Aguilar's part in the campaign was aimed primarily to make known the decree, mobilize a network of Portuguese Jewish communities that stretched like a necklace from Habsburg via Amsterdam, London, Bordeaux, Bayonne to Livorno. But d'Aguilar was also the link to the Balkan communities, having established the Turkish Jewish community in Vienna, and especially to Constantinople with the Vat Kushta that we had mentioned. Intercession with local rulers and raising necessary funds for the campaign were the goals of this intercession. D'Aguilar's ties with the London Portuguese have been mentioned, and we can also mention that he had similar sort of ties within Amsterdam through his family, the Fonsecas. For instance, the current head of the community in 1745 was a Franco Mendes, a first cousin of his wife Simcha, as well as David Franco Mendes, the chronicler of Jewish Amsterdam. His letters to the Italian communities flowed naturally from his connection through the Italian Council, and as well as we'll see with the bankers of Constantinople. The evidence sometimes is thin, the legends and second-hand rumors sometimes fill out the paper trail. His ties with high-placed officials, magnates, clerics, and other influential people, again, is very impressive. He served as the banker of both the Dutch and the English ambassadors, who he would always also meet socially, outside and at his home. He had the ear of the Papal Nuncio, to whom he sent early on in 1745 a letter, and apparently had access to Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephan, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And he had also close ties, as we'll see in a moment, with a number of highly placed officials and aristocrats with whom he also socialized. The importance of having these Jewish and non-Jewish connections in place can best be seen in the intercession in Constantinople, which has not yet been explored in detail. And I won't explore in detail because I have only 5 minutes, so you can ask me about it. I'll do it. Well, give me a mother, please. In conclusion, I would like to touch on the fourth aspect of d'Aguilar's role in expansion, and it's sort of a recall of sorts. I enter here into a more speculative realm and wish to speak about his relationship with the future Marquess de Pombal. Pombal, let me see if I can get it here. Here it is. Pombal, Pombal, The Paradox of Enlightenment and Despotism, is the title of Kenneth Maxwell's contribution to a volume of essays on enlightened absolutism, surveying the career of a minister who came to wield absolute power in Portugal from 1750 until 1777, and among his notable reforms was ending the distinction between old and new Christians in 1773. Pombal embarked on a diplomatic career where he was first ambassador to London from 1739 until 1744, then once again ambassador to Vienna from the end of 1745 until 1749 before being recalled to Portugal. And from there on, he ascended to greatness. I won't mention his ties in London, but his closest collaborator over there was Dr. Jacob Castro Sarmento, who also got him into the Royal Society in 1740 and maintained a very close relations with them. Edgar Samuel, who is a very prominent and respected historian of English history, raises the possibility that, quote, it was Sarmiento that influenced Pombal's determination to end the persecution of new Christians in Portugal. To judge by the prices paid in English currency, it was in London that Pombal added to his remarkable library an impressive collection of Jewish religion, collection on Jewish religion and history, as well as works pertaining to new Christians. We have the Bible, Talmud, Maimonides, Zohar, dozens of sermons, including those of Nieto and Sarmiento, works on the customs of Jews and theology by authors such as Luzzatto, Menachem ben Israel, Aboav, Martera, Banage, and Picard. Significantly, he also collected works touching on questions that related to Jewish returns. For instance, Toland's Reasons for the Naturalization of the Jews. And over here you can see the charter issued in 1740 by Charles IV, King of the Two Sicilies, inviting the Jews to return to Naples. And they have at least two printed translations in Portuguese. And, of course, even more important, two manuscripts of the charter that served as a model for Naples, and that was the famous Livornin, issued for peace in Leghorn in 1593 by Ferdinand, the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. When he took up residence in Vienna, his most intimate friend was another Portuguese, Manuel Teles de Silva, the Duke, Count Silva Tarocca. Tarocca had accompanied his father to Vienna when his father was a Portuguese envoy. He stayed there, and the Emperor Karl, who kept on styling himself as the King of Spain to the end of his days, had a soft spot for the Iberian expatriates and appointed Tarocca as the mentor, and this is the name of a book also, the mentor of the young Maria Teresa. So he became one of the closest that Diego and his wife were invited to by Pombal, rubbing shoulders with high aristocrats, diplomats, and military men. This is the visiting book of Pombal that recorded weeks on end in the winter months, more or less. Pombal did put an end to the discrimination distinction between old and new Christians in Portugal a few years later. And this brings us to the conclusion to speculate that Pombal's Vienna sojourn and his extensive contact with d'Aguilar might have influenced Pombal to descend, no less than his close ties with Caso Sarmento in London. And recall that Pombal's 17